Good morning, students. Today we will be seeing the histology of stomach. So you can see I put the actual photo micrograph of histology of the stomach. As we know, when we read the histology of the stomach, we will be reading stomach at two levels. One is at the level of the fundus, stomach at the level of the fundus, and one at the level of the pylorus. Now the present slide what we are seeing is the stomach at the level of the fundus. This is very important. Remember, this slide is of the stomach at the level of fundus. Now what are the important points you have to observe in the slide that belongs to the stomach at the level of fundus? Now first thing is you have the mucosa, then you have the submucosa, you have the muscularis externa, but you can see here the serosa is not visible. Okay, so the stomach has got four layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and then serosa, which is not seen in this slide. Now we will see what are the important identification points of stomach at the level of fundus. The first thing is the gastric pits, presence of gastric pits. You can see there are a lot of pits. These are the gastric pits. So the gastric pits are shallow, they are not very deep. You can see the gastric pit extending from here till only here. So this is one gastric pit, one more here, one more here. So the gastric pits are shallow. You can compare the gastric pits with the muscularis mucosa. So you can see the well developed muscularis mucosae. With this level, if you see the gastric pits, they are very shallow. You have to compare the depth of the gastric pits with the muscularis mucosae. So it is very shallow. The second thing what you have to see is the lining epithelium. The lining epithelium of the stomach is simple columnar epithelium. You can see it is simple columnar epithelium. The lining epithelium is simple columnar epithelium. So first thing what we saw is the gastric pits, which are very shallow in the case of stomach at the level of fundus. Then you see the lining epithelium is simple columnar epithelium. The second thing what you have to see here, they have long fundy glands. Long fundy glands. You can see the length of the fundy glands are quite long. They are extending from here till the muscularis mucosae. So you have the simple columnar epithelium as the lining epithelium. You have the presence of gastric pits which are shallow. Then you have long fundy glands. One more interesting feature of stomach is you have a very well formed muscularis mucosae. The muscularis mucosae of stomach is very well developed compared to other parts of the GIT. Then you have the submucosa, and then you have the muscularis externa. Remember, in the stomach, in the muscularis externa, there are three layers. The innermost layer is the oblique layer, the middle one is the circular layer, and the outermost layer is the longitudinal layer. As you can see here, you can see only a part of the muscularis externa, and serosa is completely not visible. Okay, now this is the field of focus which helps you to identify this slide as stomach. So stomach has got four layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa. And I told you what are the important identification points. So continuing with the histology of the stomach, now you can see I have put the actual photo micrograph of the stomach at the level of the pylorus. So this is the photo micrograph of histology of stomach at the level of the pylorus. Now already we have discussed the histology of stomach at the level of the fundus. Now in pylorus, what are the important things you have to identify? Look at the gastric pits, they are quite deep. Look at the gastric pits, they are quite deep. In the level of the fundus, it was shallow, but at the level of the pylorus, you can see the gastric pits are quite deep. Now, how do you compare the depth? Now, you compare the depth of the gastric pits with the level of the muscularis mucosae. This MM is muscularis mucosae. So, there is a very well formed muscularis mucosae. Compare the depth of the gastric pits with the muscularis mucosae. So, at the level of the pylorus, the gastric pits are quite deep. Rest are all same. What are the things that you are seeing? The lining epithelium is simple columnar epithelium. You have gastric pits which are quite deep. And one more thing here you can see the glands. These are the pyloric glands. The pyloric glands are short, whereas in the fundus you saw long fundy glands, but in the pylorus you see there are short pyloric glands. Then you see the muscularis mucosae and submucosa. Now in this particular picture, we are not seeing muscularis externa or the serosa, which is not visible, but actually you have presence of muscularis externa and serosa, but in this particular field of focus we have kept only till submucosa. So what are the important identifying points of histology of stomach at the level of the pylorus? You have the gastric pits, which are quite deep. The lining epithelium is simple columnar epithelium. You have short pyloric glands, and then you have a prominent muscularis mucosae. Now this will help you to identify this slide as the histology of the stomach at the level of pylorus. Thank you.